Hello everyone. I want to talk today about foundation myths and the current foundation myth we have in the West, which sprang up in the wake of World War II. Now, this discussion was prompted by a Black Pigeon Speaks video. I think it was from last June or July, so it was a while ago now, and I think the video in question has actually been removed from YouTube, but you can still find it on Minds. The Black Pigeon Speaks video was about how the West destroyed itself and how much of our current predicament has its roots in World War II. Now, I do agree with that, but I think there are some points made in the video that warrant further exploration. So I'm going to be talking about that here. I'll be using Britain as a reference point because obviously that's my experience, but to be honest, I think much of what I say could probably be applied to a lot of other countries in Europe in particular. And I think Europe in particular because that's where a lot of the, I know there was conflict all over the world, but a lot of the land war in particular took place in quite a clustered around Europe basically. The first thing I wish to address is the notion presented in the video: the baby boomers repelled for the sake of it. Now, I'm not just criticising Black Pigeon Speaks here, as it is quite common today for people to blame the baby boomer generation for the ills of the modern world. Now, I can understand why this happens, as the 1960s represent an important juncture in the war on the Western psyche, but I want to examine this boomer cook meme, as to be honest, I really don't think it is that helpful I don't think it's helpful to understand how we've got to where we currently are. And for the record, I'm not a boomer, I'm a late generation Xer. I mean, to be honest, the term Xennial sort of fits where I am and feels right to me to sum up, where I kind of fit in. But anyway, so in my last video I made the case that men and women have different roles to play, not only in upholding sovereignty but in general. Now, on the whole, men are the guardians and defenders of the land, and women are the nurturers of it in return. The men look after the land and the women, the family, and women, nurture all of that. So it's a reciprocal relationship, or at least it always has been traditionally. However, this order was shattered during the two world wars of the 20th century. I believe that these two world wars, and I regard them more as one period of conflict, to be honest, rather than separate events, operated like battering rams in demolishing the Western male psyche, and it was this destruction that paved the way for things like feminism to take hold of the culture and women in a way that it had not succeeded in doing so previously, despite repeated attempts. I believe the trauma inflicted upon European men and women as well, but women experienced it in a different way, I think. But the trauma inflicted upon men in particular by these world wars literally devastated the collective psyche of the European man, and I think it devastated it in ways that we are only just, and I mean that quite literally, beginning to fathom. For example, it's only in the past few years, since the last official commemoration of Dunkirk, that the handful of survivors left have begun, now that they are almost at the end of their lives, to talk about what actually happened out there and the massacre that it was. For most of the veterans who came home from the wars, they never spoke about what they saw, and many of them were withdrawn and distant from their children and families. And I believe that this trauma, this mass death over 20 slow years of the youngest and finest that Europe had to offer, made our forebears, the silent generation, and those that preceded them, I'm afraid I don't know the terms for them, I think they just gave up trying to understand life, to be honest. I know it's easy to throw the word trauma around today, but I think we underestimate and have forgotten what life was like back then. Now, I know from my own family, the elders in my own family, and things that they've told me from their elders, that after the First and Second World Wars, it was quite usual to see men who had obviously survived those wars on public transport, out and about in the street, men with shell shock who were, shaking quite profusely, who were visibly wounded and crippled, men who were ignored and forgotten for the most part, and this is the world that the baby boomers were born into, a traumatised population, not just because of the people who'd actually survived it, but I think psychologically as well. Their parents had tried to do the right thing and serve their respective nations as they were expected to, but doing so had led them to this massive desecration. I mean, I just don't think that in Europe there was a family that wasn't affected by the war, for, you know, definitely. So the baby boomers were raised by this absent, traumatised generation, and they grew up metaphorically and literally in some cases fatherless. At the same time, American popular culture was taking off and only too willing to step into the breach, so I think it created a bit of a perfect storm, really. It seems inevitable to me that the young baby boomers growing up with a distant and crushed parental generation with no sort of leadership or guidance tried what all children do in those circumstances when they've grown up in this kind of, you know, very neglected environment, really, to create anew with no reference to the past, because the past in that kind of childish thinking is what caused all this sorrow. Excuse me. In Britain, the blame for the wars was placed at the foot of imperialism and empire building on all sides. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily support imperialism or empire. I really think there should be an honest critique of imperialism and empire building, but I really don't think we've seen that. I just think we've seen, ooh, you know, empire bad, imperialism bad, and I think, like with any truth, it's much more nuanced than that. However, I really don't think the wars were necessarily caused by imperialism. I think they were just the excuse to hang the wars on. I think part of why the wars happened were they were a deliberate attempt by the globalists to break the European spirit, and by and large it worked. Many individual trauma survivors become proud of their new identity of being a survivor. I'm not passing judgment either way on this, but I'm merely stating what seems to happen. Now, in Britain, I think this happened collectively around how we view the Blitz, for example, because even today it's proudly referred to as our finest hour. And I'm not saying this to denigrate what, you know, the contribution that British people made back then and how people fought. You know, I'm really not intending to disrespect that at all, because I know it was a very, very difficult period, and you know, people fought very hard and were very brave. Now, I believe whatever side of the fence your ancestors on, I think they most probably all fought bravely for what they believed to be right. I really do believe that. But I also believe that this generation of the baby boomers grew up with deeply traumatised parents and grandparents as a result, which I think explains a lot about their generation. I don't think they rebelled for the sake of it. I think they were trying to create something new, which is an understandable collective reaction in the shadow of war. But the only sort of guidance they had really was this shallow popular culture that was coming into being. So I think by the time the baby boomers came of age, the silent generation, or what they got, is it the greatest generation or whatever, you know, whoever was their parents and grandparents, had really quietly allowed them to take over and hoped they would build something new, as they viewed what they had believed as an utter failure. It just caused so much death and pain. And as time's passed and we've left the wars further and further behind, I believe that simplistic narratives about the causes of the wars have sprung up, which, to be honest, they're still believed in by and large, even today. They often revolve around people like Adolf Hitler, and even now it's not uncommon to hear comments like, oh, Hitler was a madman, even today. Now, whatever your opinion of Hitler, you know, I just think that is just such basic, shallow reasoning, and it's really not helpful in looking at the causes of both world wars and attempting some real healing of this still existing trauma. Trauma operates as a kind of time lock. It arrests development and it keeps the person stuck in a survivor mentality. And I believe that collectively that's where we've been for the past 50 odd years or so, and it's something that we're only in the very beginnings of shaking off. And I think that's why, not just why, for example, so many people on the left are vehemently, I don't know, like anti-British or anti-German, you know, whatever the left are in their country, they sort of are very anti, they seem to be very anti their own country. But I think that's why those views gain traction, because they're feeding off that trauma, to be honest. Now, I believe that the narrative that sprung up in the wake of World War II is very important to the globalists, because it allows them to keep their order in place. They were the only winners of those wars, not one country or, you know, one particular alliance of nations at all. It was, they were the only ones that won. Now, the narrative that sprung up, which, you know, I'm just going to kind of summarise as Hitler was mad, because that just seems to be it to me, you know, that seems to be the popular understanding of it, is the reason why I think it's the reason why the left have been so successful in winning the culture war, because anything associated with any kind of traditionalism, anything right-leaning, is automatically perceived as being linked somehow to wanting to return to the days of empire and imperialism and etc. It's like this subconscious wound that operates, and it's like, oh, you know, you can't go near that because that's going to take us back to this kind of death and destruction, and we just can't have that. I think a lot of it is, for a lot of people, it's subconscious. It's not wanting to go near it. So I think this is why the left feel justified in using violence against their opponents, because on a subconscious level, they really believe in this narrative that anything on the right represents violence or a return to this trauma of the war. And it's successful in the West in particular, I think, because even though communism has always been far more violent and created more misery than any regime on the right ever has, most people in the West do not have ancestors that were directly affected by the trauma of communism, which I think is probably why it's easier for people in the West to still believe in. So the myth that was created was that the war was our finest hour because it destroyed what had gone before, which had, you know, led to death and destruction. That's the narrative. So what sprang up then was things that were in complete antithesis to that. So you had the hippie free love culture of the 60s, and then the feminism of the 70s, and the old ones did not really raise much of an objection to what was going on, and the young ones, they were determined to rebuild, as young ones inevitably will. And as I said, they did this by defining themselves in complete antithesis to what Britain had stood for before that. So out of the window went tradition, the stiff upper lip, reverence for institutions, and the self-confidence in our history that we had benefited the world, to one of disregarding the whole legacy of empire, believing we had nothing to offer, and looking to other cultures and countries to show us the way, because our old way had led to violence and destruction, and in particular the way of men had led to violence and destruction. This element has always been present in feminism. This is how feminism has gained traction, I think, with women, because it's like, look, men led to this violence and destruction of the war. So again, the feminism plays into this war narrative also. So this was the narrative that sprang up in the wake of the wars. Empire led to war and destruction on an unprecedented scale. And I believe this was why the 1960s saw so many people going to places like India and South America to see what they could teach us, something we had never done before. We had never looked outside of ourselves before for answers. And to be honest, I still believe that ultimately we cannot look to other countries outside of the West to help us. It really does have to come from within. So from that point, it was fairly easy for the cultural Marxists to take hold and redefine the culture in the wake of the war. And there was an emphasis on tolerance, decency and deference to other cultures, which to me shows the trauma and lack of confidence we have around our own. The implicit objection is that rejecting progressivism will lead to fascism. It seems to be that there's nothing in between. It's like 0 to 100. You know, you reject this, you want to go back to the war. the implication is we have to keep marching, we have to keep going forward, we have to get away from the past, and that way everything will be okay. I think it's quite an immature. I think it's quite a natural reaction, but I think it's quite an immature one, and I think we're sort of ready for something else now, personally. But it's one of the reasons why the establishment order of the left is vehement in its criticisms of the Trump phenomenon, Brexit, et al., and they condemn such movements regularly. If you read the page of The Guardian, as this is a return to the 1930s, you know, and it's, again, it's evidence of the trauma, I think. So I think it's time we began looking long, hard and honestly as we can at the wars and how they have traumatised the European male psyche, which led to feminism taking hold. And I'm not saying this, by the way, to blame men or the masculine. I think, you know, what's been inflicted, what's happened has been, there aren't really words to describe it, really. There aren't, well, for me, there aren't at this point. I think all we can do is try and understand it the best we can, rather than trying to run away from it, which is what I think we've been doing. But anyway, this breach in the male psyche, I think, sort of paved the way for feminism to take hold. And this psychic wall of defence that the masculine provide, as I said, was breached, and these nefarious forces got to work on the feminine in all earnest. And then the destruction of the West wholesale was begun. That was when the rot really set in. And I think that's why people sort of pinpoint the 60s and the baby boomers as, you know, it's their fault, it's their fault. And I don't think it was really. I think we should place this before. I don't think it's, I think it represented a very important turning point, but the causes of it were not here, absolutely. That was when the symptoms really started to appear, I believe. So I think the globalists had a very strong hand in all of this. They, as I've said, they were the only ones that won the wars, and the rest of Europe and the West in general suffered as a result in many, many different ways. You know, for example, in Eastern Europe there was communism, which again was very destructive. In the West we've had cultural Marxism. You only have to look at countries, I mean, you know, not just my own, but countries like Germany and France and Sweden to see how this is playing out. So deconstructing the wars and looking at them in different lights, I think it's fiercely resisted for many reasons, and one of them is because of its foundation myth status. And I think this is why Black Pigeon Speaks video was taken down off YouTube, because he was onto something, and beginning to address this trauma from a more grown-up perspective is the only way forward and the key to defeating the globalists, really. And I think this trauma explains why many baby boomers were so keen to defer to other cultures. I'm not saying everyone from that generation was, definitely not. But as I've said, trauma creates a time lock, and this made it easy for the globalists to win the culture war via their minions on the left. I don't think people on the left were necessarily, you know, they're necessarily, you know, bad people. For example, people who believe in progressivism and the culture war. I just think that they, for a lot of the time, I think they are very misguided, and they're being duped into implementing something that I don't think they'd I don't know, well, maybe, but for a lot of people, I don't think they'd necessarily want it. But it's, again, it's this trauma, this trauma, the residual trauma clouds of thinking, and it's been passed on through the generations. I think who have come later have experienced it in different ways. We've experienced the fallout from feminism, the breakdown of the family, and I think that's how, well, I know my generation in particular has experienced it, and people obviously trace that back to feminism, which is quite obvious. But then I think to look at the real causes, you have to go kind of beyond that, really. So as I was saying, the war was used as a bit of a reset button, and any movement that's tried to protest or cry halt to this has subconsciously been regarded as wanting to go back towards the war, wanting to return to this trauma. This is why any attitude of pride in the West or any kind of patriotism is shot down, because the unspoken logic is it leads to war. It's this same kind of Pavlovian dog response over and over again. We have to avoid war and death because it will be terrible, which it is. I'm not saying it's great, but we have to ultimately be pacifists, because if we're not, this will lead us into war, which will be terrible. If the wars, for example, are our current foundation myth, and I believe they are, then it does make sense to examine all the causes of the war and all aspects of it, and because this is the keystone, I think, of the West for all our the generations that are alive today. And the sooner we can start looking at this from all angles and all aspects, I think the better it will be for everybody. Now, I think the globalists know this, and that's why they're very keen to keep control of its myth, because of its power. And I think, for example, that's why in Britain the Remain opposition has been so vehement, and why it has traction. I mean, when Brexit's been going on, for example, a lot of fear came from the Remain side about what would it mean if we left the EU? What would it mean if we're on our own again? The EU was built on the back of World War II to prevent us descending into war, and if we left, we could go down that path again. Now, I think that's nonsense, to be honest, but I think it shows that this not the myth, but the trauma is still there, as if like children we are incapable of ruling ourselves. And I don't know, I'm not saying we're not, but I think it's the trauma of the war can that's how it can impact you. And I think, for example, the Germans suffer from this issue hugely. The fear of what would we become, I think that still looms quite large in the German psyche. So anyway, to conclude, I think one of the reasons we are so easily manipulated by these kind of modern narratives and foundation myths is because we've lost touch with our own traditional cultures and mythologies, which are there to help guide us through difficult times such as we're in today. Now, when thinking about not necessarily the war, but dealing with what's going on today, I'm reminded of another part of another British foundation myth, and that is the Arthurian legend cycle. And the one legend in particular is that of the Fisher King. Now, the Fisher King is a guardian of the Holy Grail and has a wound that is not healing in his groin, and it troubles him greatly. The land around him is desolate and barren, and the king is so wounded all he can do is fish in his castle moat all day. He's obviously impotent. I won't get into it too much, as I've spoken for long enough already, but suffice to say the king has forgotten how to heal, how to regenerate. Now, how to do that is another video in and of itself, but I think it's worth noting that the legend tells us that the knight Percival arrives at the castle on his Grail quest, and to help the Fisher King begin to heal, he has to ask him the right question, and this question is normally what ails thee, or who does the Grail serve? But asking the right question is key, and I think this is the first step on our journey to heal this trauma of the 2 world wars. Asking questions about this modern foundation myth of that's sprung up as a result. Anyway, that's all I've got to say for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.